I'm working on a laptop as we're recording this podcast, and it boggles the mind the amount of creative acts is necessary to put this laptop together. From the people that mined the minerals and the oil and then transported it and then refined it and put it together. We're talking about hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of people involved, and then all those things had to come together. And so that is extremely complicated and extremely, there's a huge process behind it. And yet, if this thing gets really frustrating and David doesn't fix it for me, occasionally I want to chuck it out the window. And I don't, because if I chucked it out the window, I could break it in an instant. In other words, that act of destruction is literally less than a second. To destroy something that took possibly millions of people and all this infrastructure to create. And so, therefore, any small act of creation is a big act because destruction is so easy in this world. So I think the foundational idea has to be, is the job that you're doing ultimately an act of creation? Does it create value? Or is it an act of destruction?
Hello, and welcome back to the Be Unbound podcast. I'm your co-host, David Rethemeyer.
And I'm your co-host, Jonathan Brush.
And we are, as of this recording, getting ready to leave tomorrow for the next event in Unbound's Ascend year, which is called Ridgeline. And so we are really excited for that for a number of reasons. For one, we are excited about going to any of our events. For another, it is going to be hosted down in Panama City, Florida. And so while it is unfortunately not going to be quite as balmy as you might think when I say Panama City, Florida, it's still going to be a lot warmer than at least where Jonathan and I are in Virginia at the moment. So we are excited about that. And we're just really excited because the Ridgeline is a very unique event. All the events are unique in different ways, but Ridgeline contains a lot of just learning by doing and students taking on really ambitious projects. And if you're curious as to what that looks like, you should definitely go to our YouTube channel where you can see a full video of the last year's Ridgeline event, and then we'll have the recap from this year's coming out soon. But Jonathan and I were talking and figured that it would be really interesting to talk a little bit about some of the content themes that we're going to be discussing at Ridgeline, because while Ridgeline is a very, very project-heavy event by nature, it's probably the heaviest when it comes to just students working on whatever projects that they have decided on out of anything. We do still have some content that we believe will be beneficial to them, and we think there's some really interesting themes here. So Jonathan, give us a little bit of info on what that entails.
Well, I will, but first, David, it's worth noting, so it is like 15 or 14 degrees here. Now, for those of you who are listeners in the north, you're like, big deal. That's certainly weather. For those of us in Virginia, it's a big deal. This is the blizzard of 26 coming here. I just came in from trying to break out ices. I've never done this before, David. Normally, you shovel snow. I've shoveled a lot of snow. I know how to shovel snow. In this case, I'm actually taking a hard, dirt shovel, and I'm kind of cutting blocks, and then I'm physically picking the blocks up. Some of them are almost as wide as I can spread my arms, and then carrying them over and dumping them off to the side. That's way more efficient than, it's like they're coming off in almost bricks and blocks of ice and stuff that I'm not
You got to build an igloo with it?
I'm telling you what, I was out there and I was thinking, as a kid, this is, as a kid, you always read about igloos, and then you went out and you had this powdery, stuff that just or slop or ice that just never really worked. And I was like, this is igloo building stuff here, man. So
Seriously.
You just should be happy that I came back in to do the podcast instead of staying out there to build my igloo. But good news, we've been watching the weather in Panama City Beach for a week and a half, and it's been a high of 40, which is just totally demoralizing if you're leaving cold Virginia and expect to go to Florida. But David, I just looked, and I think the high on Friday that we're going to be there has now topped 62, which, compared to where we are right now is sunburn shorts, run around, swim the beach type of weather. So pretty exciting stuff. But, well, as we're preparing for Ridgeline, and David mentioned we have that Ridgeline's kind of a project-focused event. And so what that means is that there's light content, but there's heavy work. And the work is on projects, so students are asked to commit to complete a project in 3 full days of work. And then we have some shoulder days of preparation and some days where they can show off their work. And so that's pretty exciting. But behind that is something deeper and richer and bigger. And so David and I have been playing with this. Victoria and I have been playing with this. Our staff have been kind of working with this thesis and kind of kicking around some ideas here. And so let me start with this, David. Let me kind of set this up. And listeners, this is very much a thinking out loud, working thesis type idea. So I'm not positive about all these ideas. I feel some threads that I've learned over the last several years, and I'm trying to kind of tie them or maybe even weave them together into something that makes a little more sense, it's comprehensive. So let me start with this. One thing I know a lot about is that when I work with young adults who are looking to figure out what they want to do next, that there's a pattern here. And I've observed this from my earliest days as a missions counselor back in the 90s through my career. If you ask a young adult in general what they want to do, they have absorbed some sort of idea that they should do something that's fun for them to like their work. So in other words, they subscribe to this idea. If you've been on this podcast for a while, we ridicule this all the time and talk about it as being a really bad advice. But adults tell young adults, do what you love and you'll never have to work another day in your life. Now, it's not that I'm against finding work that you love. I'm against that idea, because what happens when you tell young adults that is they go, well, what I love are my hobbies. So now I want to be a professional sports star. I want to race mountain bikes. I want to sing on stage. In other words, they pick a hobby and they want to figure out how to make money at that, because that makes sense to them. I love this, so therefore, if I could get paid to do this, it would never feel like work. Now, just to be clear, those are real careers, and we're not disparaging anybody who goes that route. They're also extremely unusual careers, and that's not an effective way to find work that you love, and that's a whole separate podcast. But in the same way, often in Christian circles and from churches, we are calling young people to address the problems and evil that we see in the world. And in fact, we do this in Unbound. We actually have a little thing that we talk about that I think I originally heard from John Stonestreet at the Colson Center. And that is that, as Christians, we are called to tell truth, celebrate beauty, and expose evil. So for Ridgeline, we talked to our students and said, I want you to think in Ridgeline in terms of how do you tell truth, celebrate beauty, and expose evil. Now, here's what happens when you say that to young people. When you say that to young people, they take that to a black and white type of bifurcation. And they say, if I was going to tell truth, I would be a pastor or an apologist. If I was going to celebrate beauty, I would clearly be an artist. And if I was going to expose evil, I would work against human trafficking or insert whatever, kind of direct, attack on evil this would be. Now, to be clear, those are all admirable, honorable, important, and exciting vocations and jobs and careers. And I'm not in any way disparaging that or calling anybody to give up the dreams of following those kinds of things. But it's a little bit like, can you make a living racing mountain bikes? You can, but there's some complications. Is it true that you can make a living telling truth as an apologist? You can, and that's fantastic. But that's not the only way to live out these commands. And that's the heart of what, we will kind of think about here. And so my argument is that any work that moves with the kingdom of God, that builds the kingdom of God, and would broaden that out and say any work then that creates value and leads to human flourishing is by definition an act of telling truth, celebrating beauty, and exposing evil. And it's not limited to those sort of set apart ministries, which are really important. So, trying to reduce this, if you are a clerk at the local 7-Eleven, are you working to build the kingdom of God and to lead to human flourishing? I would say in the exchanges with people made in the image of God, in the fact that you are helping somebody, they're exchanging money for something they want that's valuable. And in doing that, there's a way, of course, you could do that poorly, but there's a way that you could do that excellently in such a way that that very act of work would, by definition, be an act of telling truth, celebrating beauty, and exposing evil, because it's an act of participating in creation. There's a creative value to that. So, David, I'll stop there. Now that I've kind of laid the thesis out, give me your comments or your feedback as we're kind of working our way through this.
Okay. Yeah, I think this is a really interesting thesis. I'm going to play a little bit of devil's advocate here.
Perfect.
Just so that we can kick around ideas a little bit. So I could hear somebody hearing that and saying to that argument, so say, for example, like the clerk example at the gas station. They could hear that and say, okay, sure, maybe like that is something where, I could, be building the kingdom of God and creating human flourishing, but like, why would I choose to do that when I could be doing one of the other vocations? Isn't that, it feels like a bit of a stretch to say that being a clerk is providing the same kingdom building value as going out and doing mission field work. And so why would I choose the lesser option that is not going to provide as much value?
Yeah, I think that that's a really good counterpoint. And so I think, David, I'm thinking about this as you're asking the question, and I've thought about this before. And the challenge, I think, is to answer that without in any way disparaging the importance of missions work, all those set apart things. So I think that there's so pulling it back to this career thing. So there's a kind of parallel here. We often say beware of anomalies in careers. So beware of somebody who says if you work really hard and follow your dreams and do everything as hard as you can be a fighter pilot. And we say actually that is true, but it's not the truth. It's true in the sense that people who work hard, follow their dreams, like you don't accidentally become a fighter pilot. You don't accidentally become an astronaut. But it's also true that most people who pursue that don't become fighter pilots and don't become astronauts. And so consequently, there's an anomaly effect there. Does that mean that, but then we have to be careful, right? So we're trying to do two things at once. Does that mean you should not follow your dream? No. If you have a dream to be a fighter pilot or an astronaut, you should pursue that with as much vigor and energy and ability as you possibly can. But you should also understand in the broader context that that is not necessary to have a meaningful vocation that you can be passionate about. And if that doesn't work out, that doesn't mean that you are by definition a failure and that all of your life is now going to be, working in the salt mines on the chain gang or something like that because you didn't achieve that one thing. So we're trying to hold those two things at the same time. And I would say the same thing here. I think rather than trying to decrease the importance of set apart ministry or set apart kind of vocations that have direct confrontations with evil and those kinds of things, it would be a sense of elevating other vocations and other jobs. And in doing so, acknowledging this critical fact, God works in mysterious ways. And so while it certainly is possible for God to work through the big evangelist who's on stage and preaching and teaching to thousands and millions of people, it is also true that most people get to the point where they can hear that speaker's message because of the witness of somebody who might be working as a clerk at the local gas station. In other words, that there's an unseen impact there that is often more powerful and I think has scriptural basis. Is it true that the scripture elevates people like David, who would be world famous, in terms of his power and prestige and all those kinds of things? That is true. But would it be true that David is the most influential person in the Bible? Well, compared to Peter, perhaps not, right? And so now we're talking about a fisherman who is just doing his everyday job and that called to something else. And he'd say, well, then he got called to a set apart ministry. Sure. But what about the people that prepared Peter to answer the call? What Peter had some sense of looking for the Messiah. Who were the people who through those generations, nurtured and taught and prepared him so that he was able to answer the call? That has a knock-on effect that's actually quite powerful. And so I think the challenge here is to raise up other vocational activities and say, we're not in any way, if your dream is to be one of these set apart ministry things, pursue that, please do that, right? But also consider the fact that any act of creation, any act of create value work is an act that strikes against evil, tells truth, and exposes and celebrates beauty.
Okay, yeah. So I think kind of what I hear your point saying here is that we tend to just look at kind of the top 1%, the like superstars, the like most public and just kind of glamorous manifestations of what you're talking about kingdom work. And we tend to just look at those and say, okay, because like we so clearly and vividly see how much impact those have, therefore everyone should strive to do that. And what your argument is saying that just like those people who can have such a visible and powerful impact are only able to do so because there are a ton of other people below them who are supporting them and even indirectly supporting them by building up the kingdom in other ways that is making it possible for them to do that. And those people who are supporting them and doing those less glamorous kingdom building tasks are every bit as important as the ones who are up there at the top. Is that an accurate retelling of what you're saying?
Yeah, but that brings up a good point. Let's say tell truth, okay? And you can slot lots of things into these slots, right? So tell truth, okay, an apologist, an evangelist, a Christian speaker of some kind, okay, I'm proclaiming truth, great. Celebrate beauty, I'm an artist of some kind. Expose evil. I'm fighting directly against evil, law enforcement, some sort of mission working against, some sort of sin that's out in the world, right? What is interesting in those things is that none of them, none of those set apart avocations or vocations, none of those create direct value. I have to be careful the way I say this. They clearly create value. Every child saved from trafficking is created infinite value. Every soul saved creates infinite value. Every beautiful art piece produced creates value. So maybe that's not the right word. The point is that they don't create value in the same way that cutting a pile of wood does, right? Like in other words, there's no economic support there, but economic activity is necessary to support that. So if you think about, say, law enforcement, who's, protecting the community, taxes have to pay for that. Taxes have to be paid by people who are doing productive economic activity. If you talk about a pastor who's preaching at a church, that pastor is doing really important work, but it has to be supported by the economic activity of the congregation. If you talk about an artist who's creating art, there has to be patrons who appreciate that art for what it is to be able to pay for it. And that is a little bit of economic activity. So there's a little bit of a squishiness there. But the point is that those set apart things require that. I had a pastor when I was quite young, young like being a teenager, which feels quite young now. And my church had a volunteer group. You would volunteer to go into this service organization and basically live in poverty level. I think it paid $30 a month at the time in order to do really deep ministry work. And I was really struck by that. Like, I was kind of like, everybody should do that. And my pastor, who was a big advocate for this and somebody I looked up to, I remember I was driving with him to dinner and he kind of scoffed and he's like, I mean, somebody has to pay for those people. And his point was like, he was a little annoyed at like the pedestal I was putting those folks on. And he was not disparaging them. He was just saying, for every one of those volunteers out there working, there's 4 or 5 or 6 or 8 solid church members who are working hard, creating economic activity that then are tithing and giving and donating to these organizations to make that stuff work. Let's not miss them. And I think the root of my argument is coming at some level there. And so, David, let's try it this way, because I think this is, directly what you were saying, is that, let's pick a more menial job. And so right now, it's really hard to find plumbers. Okay. So let's say you're a person who, you graduate from high school, you get into the plumbing business. And so you spend some time doing the hard work. And then you're not a big entrepreneur, but you scrape together some money, you hang out a shingle, you get a little shop, and you start a plumbing business, right? And you hire never more than 3 or 4 guys. And so now let's think about what's actually going on. The way you do this is very important, right? But now you've got let's say this is a plumbing operation that, charges fair, solid prices, gives honest, high quality work. And now let's look at the impact of those compared to, say, some of these more glamorous things, right? That person supporting let's say it's a guy, supporting his family, okay? He's hiring 4 or 5 other people and he's paying them, solid wages. He's not trying to pay them the lowest dollar. He's trying to pay them living wages. And so now 4 or 5 other families are tithing to their church, which helps these set apart ministries, are taking care of their children, are paying taxes that pays for our protective stuff, maybe even buy art at some point, because they care about it, or, they're paying for some music or something like that. When your plumbing stopped up, it's a major problem. Or if your pipes freeze, or if you're trying to put in a new, so when you need it, to call them and have them come any hour of the day or night on the weekends to fix up. If your hot water heater is broken and it's 8 degrees outside, all of a sudden hot water looks like less of a luxury and more of a necessity. And, these guys might come and do a service call on a weekend or on an evening or something like that. And so that's really creating value of the kind that, you don't think about your plumbing until your plumbing doesn't work. And then you think about it a lot and then you want it fixed. And so there's adding value to that. And then all the people that they add value to, that enables them to do whatever activities they're doing. I know from when I've had plumbing problems, when the plumbing's broken, I'm not working for Unbound. I'm dealing with the problem with my plumbing, right? And then the plumbers come out and fix it, and I can get back to doing what I do to create value. In other words, there's a knock-on effect that is important. And I think my point here is to say that creative work of plumbing is inherently, fundamentally, foundationally telling truth, celebrating beauty, and exposing evil in a way that we sometimes fail to see. Does that mean that everybody should be plumbers? No, that's not the argument I'm making here. But it does mean that if you are a plumber, you should see it as less like, well, I'm a plumber and I could have been an astronaut, and more like, I'm a plumber, God called me to be here, and I have significant, important, serious, universe-shaking, eternal meaning work to do building the kingdom of God in what I'm doing, not in preparation for something else. The work I'm doing is actually foundationally a work of creativity and creation. I'm made in the image of God, so I'm doing image bearer work. And that is fundamentally the kind of work that progresses the kingdom of God and has worth far beyond just the fact that I'm fixing a few pipes and making enough dollars to pay my rent.
Yeah, yeah. I follow that logic track. I think that makes a lot of sense. Now, here's an interesting point that I think is worth us talking about and bringing up in this is that it sounds like from what you're saying, and that like there you brought up quite a few different examples. It sounds like this is something that can be done pretty much anywhere. Is it sounds like what you're saying is that like you can find a way to make your work kingdom building in pretty much any vocation. And the question that kind of comes to my mind that I wonder if some of our listeners might think of too is that, okay, by that token, like, is that actually true? Can it actually pretty much any work be kingdom building, or are there going to be some areas of work where you look at it and you realize, like, wait, no, like, I shouldn't be like pursuing this. Like, this is not actually kingdom building work. I need to be looking a different direction. How do you find that discernment?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think there's let me go to the side just for a second and then come back to it.
Mhm.
Part of the argument here is that the act of creativity is the foundational battle against evil. And so I would equal that good. I'd argue that good equals creativity. If you're made in the image of God, that means a lot of things, but at heart, it has to mean that you are a creator of value, because God, maybe the most visible attribution of God is as a creator. And if you're made in God's image, you're made to create. And to create would be to create anything of value. So broadening that out really wild, right? Really, really wide. So then what is the opposite of create? Well, it's to destroy. And so evil at heart then is an act of destruction. And I think that the importance of this is so critical because, I'm working on a laptop as we're recording this podcast, and it boggles the mind the amount of creative acts was necessary to put this laptop together. From the people that mine the minerals and the oil and everything else from the earth at kind of that macro level, and then transported it and then refined it and put it together. We're talking about hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of people involved, and then all those things had to come together. And so that is extremely complicated and extremely, there's a huge process behind it. And yet, if this thing gets really frustrating and David doesn't fix it for me, occasionally I want to chuck it out the window. And I don't, because if I chucked it out the window, I could break it in an instant. In other words, that act of destruction is literally less than a second to destroy something that took possibly millions of people and all these infrastructure to create. And so, therefore, any small act of creation is a big act because destruction is so easy in this world. So we're looking at this kind of creative act. So then when you say, does any vocation do this? Well, I think the foundational idea has to be, is the job that you're doing ultimately an act of creation? Does it create value? Or is it an act of destruction? And probably like most things, it's easier to push out to the ends here, but then let's come back to the middle. So we push out to the ends, is it an act of creation to take photographs, beautiful photographs of people, portraits, and do that in a way that's extremely high value and act of creation? So yes, absolutely.
Mhm.
But that same skill, if used for pornography, would ultimately be an act of destruction to destroy both the people being used as an object, or the objectification of the person, as well as the ongoing destruction that would happen from people who then use that pornography. Is it possible to use your ability to do math and to create things and to create marketing pieces and all those kinds of things? Yes, that would be an act of creation. But let's say, and maybe we're getting a little bit more stepping on toes, work for the gambling industry. Well, ultimately, gambling is an act of destruction, right? I mean, it's it destroys. The house always wins. It destroys the money. It destroys the value of the people who are gambling. And so, if you're talking about, using those abilities to work for a large casino, understand that at root, and I'll stomp on some more toes, or even for a lottery system, for a state, at root, you're ultimately working not to create value, but to destroy value. So it's an act of destruction. And then I'd say, let's come in a little bit closer and get really, controversial. Would it be an act of creation to work for an insurance company? Yes, absolutely. I have insurance. I need insurance to be able to function as a business and for my household and all those kinds of things. And when things go wrong, insurance companies are essential. Could you work for an insurance company as an act of destruction? Certainly. My wife had an accident several years ago when somebody hit her coming out of our driveway, And we fought for like 8 months with an insurance company that absolutely refused to pay what was an obvious claim that they absolutely had to pay, but we're hoping that we would drag into the courts where we would have to pay too much money. In other words, they actively worked against being able to provide any kind of justice or any kind of recompense for an action done by somebody who's clearly their fault. And so, ultimately, if you're part of that system, oh yeah, you have to be a little bit careful there. That probably looks like an act of destruction. So, when you say an active creation, active destruction, that sounds really big. I think there's some nuance there that you have to say, am I working in such a way that I'm creating value, or am I working in such a way that I'm ultimately destroying something? And the answer to that would determine whether does your job qualify? Yes, if it's an active creation, I'd say then that fundamentally and foundationally, you're doing kingdom work that has great honor, great impact, and great importance. And if you're doing something that's ultimately an act of destruction, you should flee as fast as possible.
Yeah. This is really interesting. I'm going to take it just one level a little bit deeper here, because I think this is something that I hear a lot of people struggling with, and when they're thinking about just like the ethics and morality of their work is, let's say, for example, somebody is doing some sort of like creative job for, let's say, Amazon, right? And so, they're working in a job that they're comfortable with, that they enjoy, they feel like they are like actively creating value. But there's also the fact, I don't think that it's terribly controversial to say this, that Amazon has some shady history with like treating their workers extremely poorly and having some connections with some other, just like some supply chains that also have very, very poor work conditions. And so in that sense, like, are you in that specific role creating value in a positive way? Yes, but you're doing it for an organization that does a lot of things that are very destructive and are destroying things. How do you figure out where to sit with that? Is that something that you can reconcile well? Do you have any perspective on that?
Yeah, I might offer perspective and nothing else, because I think that's a really important question, and I'm don't want to set myself up here and say I have the answer to that. So if you're listening to this, listen cautiously. This is me thinking through this, not providing an answer, because I think that's a really important question with an answer that's harder than just a soundbite, right? So I think personally, and this rings true for me. I left an organization because at some level I felt like I was participating in an act of destruction, even though the organization was ultimately working towards an active creation. So let's not be cute about it. I worked for a college. I think colleges are definitely in creative work, clearly. I mean, by definition. But I was working in college as a director of admissions, and I felt like on the whole, while the college's motives were good and they did lots of good things, I was asking too many people to go into what I consider to be crippling debt that made sense, right? So I had to earn a living by asking people to make decisions that I thought were ultimately bad. And so consequently, I had to draw a line and say, for me, and I didn't want to say this organization is evil. I didn't believe that at all. But I thought my particular role in that organization, where I had to talk to a student and realize that, and I had no problem talking to students saying this is a bad financial decision for you. But the point was, there was lots of students who would make bad financial decisions that I didn't talk to. And I needed enough of them in order for us to make our class that I realized that fundamentally there was a problem here, right? And so I couldn't participate in that way. And I think that, countering that over to Amazon or something similar to that, I think maybe the foundational question I would start with is, does this organization fundamentally, is it the purpose of this organization to create value? And I'd say you'd have to say Amazon fundamentally creates value. I'm just looking around at my desk and there's a whole lot of things I ordered from Amazon, right?
Yep,
and so there's definitely a create value part here. And then there'd be other aspects of this company that destroy people. Well, yeah, because it's human and we're sinful and we're in a sinful world, right? And so then I think it has to come down to, is the thing that I'm participating in ultimately working towards creating value or destruction? So if I'm, working on systems to make Amazon more efficient so it's easier to buy things on Amazon, I'd say you could make a solid argument that that's creating value. If I'm working on systems that commodify and objectify workers so that we can squeeze more value out of them while paying them less, and just to be clear, I'm not saying Amazon's doing that. I don't have any knowledge of that. I'm just saying that could be a possibility, right? Big companies can do that. Then I would say that, you'd have to really question your work and say, I think ultimately I'm participating in active destruction here, not an active creation. Now, I'm not sure if that's a final answer in the sense that that's comprehensive to cover all situations. I'm just trying to speak out of my own experience and think about how I might apply that. Would I think of myself, would I become an Amazon delivery driver? Sure. I want people to deliver my packages, and I become an Amazon delivery driver that's not scared of Labrador retrievers who wag their tails, which is what the Amazon delivery drivers come to my house are always worried about. And I'm like, seems to me if you can't tell the difference between an aggressive pit bull and a happy Labrador, you're probably in the wrong vocation. But anyhow, I digress. So I could do that, but would I work for Amazon, in a scenario where I was trying to, exploit workers, and work them for as many maximum hours as possible and minimize their pay, which again, I have no idea if Amazon's doing. Yeah, I don't think I could participate in that. Same company, different aspects. Ultimately, I don't think I'd have a moral problem with anybody working for Amazon. They create value, but I'd have to think carefully about my role and what I was doing there. That's me thinking out loud, David.
Yeah. I think that's extremely valid. I think that's one of those questions that if somebody does have a definitive black and white answer that works for every situation, you should be very cautious of it. Because I think that there's a lot of wisdom in what you said, and really, like, at the end of the day, it is one of those decisions that I think we should just rely on wisdom that God gives us in perspective to be able to make those kinds of decisions, because there's a lot of those where you can follow that chain down and say, like, well, ultimately, even if I'm working in any role at some point, like, I'm creating some amount of value for the company, and somewhere along the line, like, that's contributing to them doing things that I don't like. And so how do you reconcile that? And I think, like, there's got to be some element of just, like, taking that to prayer, just very practically, and just saying, like, God, is this where you want me to be? And if you feel convicted about that, then yeah, I don't think that there's anything scripturally that would say, hey, just because, like, you have some hesitations means that you can't leave the job. I think there's just a lot of room for us to just be able to take that to prayer and just ask for guidance for that. And there's not a definitive black or white answer to things like that.
Yeah, maybe we should be something I could say maybe a little more firmly here would be a caution. There is no human institution that you work for that will not at some point ask you to make that decision. Like, I want to kind of back up a little bit here and say Amazon may need criticized. I've read articles about how Amazon treats its workers occasionally, but I'm loath to kind of pull Amazon out and make them the villain. There are churches who abuse their pastors. And there are certainly churches who have done sinful things and covered it up, right? I mean, like, there are nonprofit organizations that steal money and cheat and defraud donors and stuff like that, and there are all kinds of companies. There are phenomenal auto repair shops, and I delivered auto parts when I was in high school, and there were shops that I knew for a fact were deliberately taking out working parts and putting new ones in and cheating customers, right? In other words, there is no industry and there is no company and there is no organization that eventually you will not be faced with a moral question of what is the ultimate aim of this company. And I think companies that were created originally to create value can move into destructive companies, and that companies that ultimately create value can do destructive things. And sometimes it's a matter of calling those out and reforming from within, and that's why you're placed there. And sometimes you are called to leave. And so, yeah, I think that, and I would say, Unbound's no exception. Like, I don't know that we're doing anything destructive, but I don't think we're immune from it. And so we ought to be really careful not to say, yeah, those outside companies, that will be a problem. I think we ought to, find ways to make sure that the people inside of our own organizations we should constantly be looking, because there will always be a temptation to start to drift away from creating value and into destruction, away from creation and destruction, because that's the ultimate temptation. And so maybe just a word of caution that you won't ever work for an organization that gets this right all the time. And so consequently, this is a question to be asked all the time, and you have to confront it. And that, often that will be a reformer. Like, I don't think we should do that. Oh yeah, we shouldn't do that. Sometimes it will require you to say, I cannot participate in this anymore. And, that's an important thing to keep in mind.
Yeah, that's a very good distinction. And yeah, I mean, just to be completely transparent about just like where we're at with things, like, we produce this podcast and we have a lot of fun producing this podcast. At the same time, we very much espouse people spending less time watching and consuming content online, that generally speaking, and spending more time being out in the real world and doing things. And yet here we are creating lots and lots of content, and even more personally for me, I run a lot of ads for our company, and ads are a really important way that we find new customers and that we get people to be aware of what we do at Unbound. And at the same time, when I'm running ads, I'm paying Meta and Facebook and Instagram, and there's a lot of things that Facebook and Instagram do that I'm really not happy about. And so that's something that I personally have wrestled with, is just trying to, think through, how okay am I with giving that company money in order to promote what we do? And so that's something that I still, to some extent, have a slight bit of discomfort with. But I think that's okay. And I think to some extent that's healthy to have that a little bit of awareness of the discomfort that exists. It's just, to your point, just a reality of living in a sinful world, is that you're always going to, and I think always should as a Christian, have some level of discomfort with the fact that we are in a very broken world. Does that mean that we should be absolutely flabbergasted and surprised? No, because scripture tells us that we are in a very broken world, and that's going to manifest pretty much everywhere. But I think it is healthy to recognize that and to say, there are some parts of that that I really don't like, but still just think through how you are uniquely equipped and called to create value, and work through that and see how God is equipping you to do that in the midst of a very broken world.
Those are good summarizing and wise words, David. And so thank you, listeners, for coming along as we kind of think about this out loud. I found that, some of these ideas take root, and then often it requires some sort of public discussion. Sometimes we do that in speaking, sometimes we do that in teaching, and sometimes we do that in podcasts. And then some feedback that is often both, hey, this makes sense to me, and sometimes corrective. And so with that in mind, if you have feedback for us, please feel free to reach out to us here at Unbound. And of course, we'd love it if it makes sense to you, and that's helpful. Sometimes it's more helpful if you think, I think you missed the mark a little bit here. I think you're thinking a little bit differently, and that's helpful as well. So thanks for letting us be transparent, sort of think out loud publicly here, and share some of these ideas. We appreciate you coming along for the conversation. Until next time, be Unbound.